The rain in the valley of Krovos didn't simply wash things clean. It merely pressed the grime deeper into the grain of the wood, the pores of the skin, and the very soul of the earth. My arrival was marked not by a welcome committee, but by the collective turning of backs as my car sputtered to a halt in the center of the hamlet, the engine dying with a choke that sounded suspiciously like a death rattle. The innkeeper, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from dried apple skin and left to cure in vinegar, handed me the iron key with a reluctance that made my stomach turn over, his knuckles white as bone. He didn't look me in the eye when he took my money, his gaze fixed firmly on the iron crucifix hanging above the register, muttering a prayer that sounded more like a desperate plea for immunity than a blessing. I had come here for the isolation, seeking a quiet, forgotten place to finish my thesis on agrarian folklore, but the silence of Krovos was not peaceful. It was a held breath, a tension that vibrated in the damp air like the hum of a high-voltage wire waiting to snap and lash out at the nearest living thing. I dragged my heavy luggage through the sucking mud toward the cabin, situated at the edge of the tree line, feeling the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes drilling into my spine from the darkened windows of the village proper. The warnings had started immediately, whispered by the old woman sweeping the stoop of the general store, who had gripped my wrist with surprising strength, her fingernails digging into my pulse point. She had hissed about the night woman, a moniker that sounded almost quaint, like a bedtime story to frighten children into obedience, until I saw the genuine animalistic terror etched into her cataracts. They told me she did not belong to the forest, but to the spaces between the waking world and the dark, a parasite that fed on the attention of newcomers who didn't know the old rules of the valley. I laughed it off then, a city academic arrogant in my rationality, dismissing their superstitions as the product of isolation, inbreeding, and lead in the water, but my laughter died the moment I stepped across the rotted threshold of the cabin and felt the temperature drop 20 degrees in a single heartbeat. The interior of the cabin smelled of ancient dust and something sweeter, cloying and rot-heavy, like lily left too long on a fresh grave in the heat of summer. I spent the first few hours trying to scrub the sensation of being watched from my skin, lighting every kerosene lamp I could find until the small wooden room blazed with artificial courage, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to mock my trembling hands. I arranged my books on the scarred oak table, trying to impose order on the chaos of the atmosphere, but my focus kept drifting to the single window that faced the encroaching woods, the glass old and warped, distorting the trees outside into skeletal fingers clawing at the gray sky. I remembered the specific instruction the innkeeper had finally shouted as I walked away, a directive that had seemed absurd at the time, but now felt like a lifeline. Do not leave a chair facing your bed, and never look at the corners when the candle flickers. Night fell over Krovos with a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of absolute black that the lamps struggled to push back, the darkness seeming to consume the light rather than be illuminated by it. I felt foolish moving the heavy wooden chair to face the wall, the legs scraping loudly against the floorboards, a sound that seemed to echo for miles in the stillness, screaming my location to whatever lay in the woods. I sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under my weight, clutching a notebook but writing nothing, my ears straining against the silence that was not truly silent, but filled with the wet, dripping noises of the forest. The villagers had said she comes when the mind is closest to sleep, when the barriers of logic are lowered, slipping in through the cracks in your perception like smoke through a keyhole. I told myself it was just the wind, just the settling of the old timber, but then I heard the sound of wet footsteps on the porch, heavy and deliberate, indistinguishable from the pounding of my own blood in my ears. I blew out the lamps one by one, leaving only a single candle burning on the knitstand, a foolish hope that darkness might hide me better than light, that if I couldn't see her, she couldn't see me. I lay back, pulling the scratchy wool blanket up to my chin, my eyes squeezed shut as I tried to force my breathing into a slow, steady rhythm, playing the part of a sleeping man while my mind raced with adrenaline. Sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach, blocked by the visceral certainty that I was not alone in the room, that something had entered when my eyes were closed, bypassing the locked door as if it were merely a suggestion. The air grew colder, a sharp, biting chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside, smelling of stagnant pond water, wet fur, and old copper blood. I lay frozen, every muscle locked in a rictus of terror, waiting for a sound, a touch, anything to confirm the madness growing in my mind, my body betraying me by paralyzed compliance. Then came the sound of breathing, raspy and wet, originating from the space directly beside my headboard, intimate and invasive. It wasn't the rhythmic inhaling of a living thing, but a stuttering, broken gasp, like air being forced through a crushed windpipe or lungs full of swamp water. I wanted to scream, to leap from the bed and crash through the window, to run until my lungs burned, but my body had been hijacked by a primal instinct to play dead in the face of an apex predator. I could feel the displacement of the air, a pressure wave moving closer, and the scent of decay became overwhelming, filling my nose and throat until I wanted to gag, tasting the rot on the back of my tongue. The warnings of the villagers replayed in my mind, a chaotic loop of voices telling me that to see her was to invite her in, that acknowledgment was the key she needed to turn the lock of my soul and take up residence. I opened my eyes. I don't know why I did it. Perhaps the human need to know the face of death is stronger than the will to survive, or perhaps she forced them open with her will. She was standing there, towering over the bed, her height impossible, her head grazing the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, bending her neck at a sickening angle to look down at me. She was not translucent or ghostly. She was horrifyingly solid, a mass of gray, necrotic flesh draped in rags that looked like they had been pulled from a bog and dried in the smoke of a funeral pyre. Her arms were too long, hanging down past her knees, ending in fingers that were more like charred twigs, twitching with a malignant energy, the nails long, yellow, and curved like hooks. But it was her face that shattered my sanity, a visage devoid of eyes, just smooth, pale skin where sockets should be, and a mouth sewn shut with thick, black twine that pulled the flesh into a permanent, pained grimace. She did not move, yet she was vibrating, a low-frequency tremor that I could feel in my teeth and in the marrow of my bones, a resonance that made the room feel unstable. The candle flame on the knit-stand didn't flicker. It bent away from her, as if the fire itself was repulsed by her presence, casting the room into a skewed, unnatural twilight. I stared up at the nightmare, tears hot and stinging, leaking from the corners of my eyes, my mind screaming for my limbs to move, to fight, to run, but the connection was severed. She leaned down then, her spine cracking with the sound of breaking dry wood, a sound so loud it was like a gunshot in the small room, bringing that featureless face inches from my own. I could see the pores in her gray skin, the moisture on the black thread binding her lips, and I realized with a jolt of pure white-hot horror that she was trying to speak through the sutures. The sound that emitted from behind the sewn lips was a high-pitched mewling, a wretched, muffled cry of agony that drilled straight into the center of my brain and bypassed my auditory nerves entirely. The villagers had warned me she would try to take my voice to replace the one she had lost, but they hadn't described the hypnotic pull of her presence, the way she seemed to drink the terror radiating off me. I felt a pressure on my chest, immense and crushing, as if the gravity of the room had localized directly on top of my sternum, pressing the air out of my lungs. Her hand, the one with the twig-like fingers, began to rise, moving with a jerky stop-motion quality, reaching toward my face with agonizing slowness. I knew if she touched me, if that dead flesh made contact with mine, I would never leave this cabin, never leave this valley, becoming just another cautionary tale whispered to arrogant travelers in the tavern. I summoned every ounce of will, biting my tongue until the sharp tang of copper flooded my mouth, using the shock of pain to break the paralysis holding me down. I threw myself sideways, rolling off the mattress and hitting the floorboards with a bone-jarring thud that knocked the wind out of me, scrambling away like a crab. The candle toppled and extinguished, plunging the room into absolute impenetrable darkness, save for the gray moonlight filtering through the warped window, which now seemed to illuminate nothing but terror. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, kicking blindly at the space where the bed was, expecting to feel cold hands grabbing my ankles and dragging me into the void. The room was silent again, the rasping breathing gone, but the air was still thick with the smell of the grave, and I knew she wasn't gone. I fumbled for the door, my fingers slipping on the latch, my breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps that tore at my throat, my nails scratching uselessly against the wood. The wood of the door felt like ice, freezing my skin, burning with cold, but I finally wrenched it open and stumbled out onto the porch, the rain hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't stop to look back. I ran towards the village, slipping in the mud, crashing through bush that tore at my clothes and skin, imagining her long arms reaching out from every tree trunk. The darkness of the woods felt alive, every rustle of leaves sounding like her disjointed footsteps, every shadow looking like her elongated silhouette twisting in the periphery of my vision. I reached the inn, pounding on the heavy oak door until my knuckles bled, screaming for them to let me in, to save me from the thing in the cabin, begging for sanctuary in a place that offered none. The door remained shut, the windows dark, the village of Krovos turning its back on me just as it had upon my arrival, their silence a condemnation more absolute than any verdict. I huddled on the stoop, shivering violently, clutching my knees to my chest, watching the tree line for the movement of gray rags, fully expecting to die there in the mud. I waited for dawn with the desperation of a condemned man, listening to the wind howl through the valley, carrying with it the faint, muffled sound of weeping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. When the first gray light of morning finally touched the peaks, I walked back to my car, leaving my luggage, my books, and my sanity in that cabin, refusing to even look at the structure as I passed. I drove until the gas tank was empty, putting hundreds of miles between me and the night woman, shaking uncontrollably, thinking I had escaped the nightmare of Krovos. The isolation I sought has become my prison. I cannot be around others, for fear they will sense the rot clinging to me, or worse, that she will turn her attention to them. I have covered all the mirrors in my apartment with heavy cloth, for sometimes out of the corner of my eye I see her reflection standing behind me, her sewn mouth twitching. I sleep with the lights on now, a rack of industrial floodlights rigged in my bedroom, but the bulbs burn out with alarming frequency, popping one by one as the witching hour approaches. I have tried to research her to find a way to banish the entity, but every book on folklore I open seems to have pages torn out, or the text rearranges itself into nonsense before my eyes. The only coherent message I have found was scrawled in the margins of my own thesis draft, in a handwriting that is jagged and unfamiliar. She is the keeper of the silence, and you have broken it. My health is deteriorating. My skin has taken on a grayish, pallid hue, and I am losing weight rapidly, as if the energy is being leached from my body to sustain her manifestation. I cough up black bile in the mornings, and my throat is constantly sore, feeling as though it is being constricted by invisible twine. I realize too late that the villagers didn't just ignore me. They were waiting for me, a sacrifice to keep the beast fed and away from their own doorsteps for another generation. I was the offering, the fresh battery for an ancient machine of terror, and by escaping the valley, I merely extended the ritual, bringing the altar with me. I am living on borrowed time, waiting for the night when the paralysis won't break, when the lights will fail completely, and she will finally finish the sentence she started to speak. Last night was the worst yet. The breathing wasn't just beside the bed, it was directly above me, hot and fetid against my face, moistening my skin. I felt the weight of her settle onto the mattress, the springs groaning under a mass that shouldn't exist, shifting as she crawled over me. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, tears leaking out, murmuring prayers to a God I hadn't believed in for years, while her twig-like fingers stroked my hair with a mocking tenderness. She whispered something then, the sound vibrating through my skull, the sewn lips stretching the threads to their breaking point to form words. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a curse. It was a simple statement of ownership that chilled my blood to absolute zero. You are the home I have been looking for. I know I cannot run anymore, for there is nowhere to go when the haunter lives inside your own perception, nesting in the blind spot of your vision. I am writing this not as a warning, for warnings are useless against things that do not obey the laws of nature, but as a record of what happens when you look too deep into the dark. If you find this, do not go to Krovos. Do not look for the cabin, and for the love of God. If you wake up to the smell of pond water, do not open your eyes. She is waiting for you to notice her, waiting for the validation of your fear, and she has an eternity to wait. The sun is setting now, the shadows in the corners of my room are lengthening and stretching into familiar shapes, and I can already hear the first wet rasp of breath from the hallway. The psychological toll is perhaps heavier than the physical threat. The constant questioning of my own reality, the inability to trust my senses. Is that a coat rack in the corner, or is it her, standing perfectly still, mimicking the furniture until I lower my guard? Is the tap dripping, or is that the sound of her weeping, the moisture leaking from the black threads? I have become a prisoner of my own mind, a labyrinth where every turn leads back to the cabin, back to that moment of eye contact. I have thought about ending it, about taking the final exit to escape the torment, but I am terrified that death would not be an escape, but merely a transition to her domain, a place where the lights never turn on. Tonight I will not fight. I will leave the chair facing the bed. I will blow out the candle myself, and I will wait for her in the dark. I am tired of running, tired of the fear, tired of the cold that never leaves my bones, no matter how high I turn up the heat. Perhaps if I listen to what she has to say, if I let her speak without pulling away, the torment will end, one way or another. The breathing is at the door now. The handle is turning slowly, grinding with the rust of the valley, and the smell of lily and grave earth is filling the room. I am closing my eyes for the last time. The night woman is here, and she has brought the silence with her.